The views and opinions expressed in this broadcast are those of the speakers or authors and do not necessarily reflect or represent the views and opinions held by the producers of this broadcast. The material herein is for entertainment purposes only.
Welcome to Scary Stories with Kalila and my host, Allan Gilbreath, here to join me this evening. We're going to be exploring a little bit more on that Jack fellow that we talked about last week, because he's very interesting, and there's a lot of theories about where this guy came from, and is he related to some of the other Jacks in our history that were not so savory. But I want to tell you a little story here. Imagine, if you will, and this is a very common theme. Imagine you go to a party and you're talking to a gentleman. You meet a gentleman at a party, or perhaps it's a bar. He's a doctor, very interesting chap. You meet him, you're having wine with him. He's just absolutely sweeping you off his feet. He's captivating you with stories, you're laughing, you're drinking. So you think it's okay to invite him back home with you. After all, you trust him. He's a doctor, right? So you trust him, you bring him back home. You have one more drink, you leave the room, you come back in, but that last glass of wine doesn't hit you just right. Suddenly you're feeling very dizzy, feeling very out of sorts. You can't see straight, you're seeing spots before your eyes. And before you know it, you black out. When you come to, you see a blurry figure, you're in a bathroom, you become very aware that you're laying in the bathtub, and you see your doctor, he's walking out the door with some sort of canister in his hand. Before he leaves, he leans over and he sets a phone on the tub. As you're struggling to get up, you realize that you're surrounded by ice cubes. You're in a tub of ice. He tells you as he's walking out to pick up the phone and call the hospital. One of your kidneys has been taken. You'll need to be taken in right away. Can you think of anything more terrifying than somebody who would gain your trust just to get one of your organs? It's everybody's nightmare, isn't it? Well, that's exactly what happened to a lot of people back in London, back in the late 1800s with the Whitechapel murders and an individual called Jack the Ripper. We're going to be looking at some of his crimes and why they believe that he was a doctor, and I believe he was removing organs, wasn't he, Alan?
Well, the
a little bit different scenario.
Yeah, well, I mean, but the crimes elevated, and the dissections became more brutal. So the more uninterrupted time he had with his victim, the more things he did to them. So, was he a doctor? I have no idea. Matter of fact, history has kind of pointed out he probably wasn't, but he was probably somebody used to using a knife.
Well, did he have quite an extensive knowledge, did it seem, of the human anatomy, more so than someone else might have at that time?
Not really. Okay, let's once again, let's set the Wayback Machine and let's talk about going shopping in White Castle versus going shopping at the local mini mart today. Basically we are just before refrigeration. Most people do not have any way of keeping food, right? We could can it, we could dry it, but generally every day you went to the market to get 6 eggs and a loaf of bread and whatever it is you were going to eat that day. They didn't have deep pantries like we have now. They didn't have the canning and the sanitation. So the marketplace was kind of your central world. But because of this, how do I put this delicately? If you wanted fried chicken tonight, his name was Bob. you met Bob. You picked Bob out of a cage, you put Bob in your cage, and Bob went home with you. And when you got ready for dinner, you ended Bob, which meant the average person in that time wasn't squeamish about converting something alive to food.
No, that's true. That's true. Even when I was growing up, I mean, I was born later in life, but I remember my parents talking about when my brother and sister were little, and they had chickens in the yard. They also had rabbits, and I mean, my brother and sister remembered, butchering the chickens and the rabbits, and I was mortified, of course.
You went and got
50s,
Fluffy.
yeah.
Well, you went and got Fluffy, and you calmed it down, and you petted it behind its little neck, and you grabbed it's little feet, and you stretched it until it wasn't a rabbit anymore. So it's difficult for people today to really kind of understand the day-to-day life prior to a refrigerator, because it really was the village. You really did have to go walk down. You really did have to get out and go get into the streets. Because today we're like, well, why didn't you just stay home? Well, you didn't have that option. Of drinking water was kind of dicey. Sanitation was dicey. We didn't, bathing wasn't all that hot a topic until we got into the world wars. It was kind of a dramatically different world. Now, when we watch a modern take on, let's say, like Sherlock Holmes, the good news is the theater doesn't show the movie in smell-o-vision. Because, and you'll notice everybody drinks. Everybody drinks. Nobody has a soda. Everybody has a pint of something. And that's basically because water wasn't safe. You drank beer. You drank some kind of spirit. So being a different world like that, I don't have a problem with whoever was committing these atrocities having an understanding of how to take a body apart. They'd obviously butchered a chicken or a rabbit or a goose. And as much as we like to think humans are unique, we're not. We look pretty much stretched out like any other critter stretched out. And the organs and things are all organ about the same. So adding to it the fact that in that day and time, most people had a pretty good working knowledge of what the inside of an animal looked like. So I don't think we can I don't want to rule out a doctor, of course, but I don't want to say it had to be a doctor, because in those days, knowing your way around the inside of a critter was a fairly important skill. And a lot of the suspects that were thought of or investigated or looked at, one of them was an upholsterer. His whole life was knives.
Wow. Okay.
And he was used to cutting through things and cutting things open and making very precise cuts. Now, to the average lay person, if you see something cut up and taken apart, I don't know how you would just automatically look at it and go, oh, well, only a surgeon could have done that. So could anybody that worked in a butcher shop.
That's true. Yeah, butcher shop for sure. Yeah.
And there were a couple of suspects that were part-time butchers on the long list of people that could have been Jack the Ripper. So, I can't look at the evidence of the fact that he dissected a person doesn't necessarily mean it was medical curiosity.
Well, I've always wondered if Jack the Ripper wasn't indeed our Jacques Saint Germain who came here, because the Jack the Ripper time frame, a lot of people have suggested that perhaps, but supposedly Jacques Saint Germain did spend some time in England before he came to New Orleans in 1901, and the Jack the Ripper case was between 1888 and 1890 something. So you've got a little bit of a time gap there, but it's close enough that it would fit. More so than, I mean, you suggested last show the Spring-Heeled Jack, which is a very interesting character. Very much more like the Jack that we have in our more modern story, where he just takes flight. He seems to just swoosh out of nowhere. But Spring-Heeled Jack seemed like it was a little bit earlier in the 1800s, though, more in the Victorian times, like the 1830s.
He appears and disappears all throughout history, including appearances in the U.S. later.
Oh, really?
So, you know, that's what kind of makes this the most terrifying idea behind these characters, is that there's a lot of overlap for a couple of hundred years. A mysterious figure appears out of the dark. Well, of course they did. They had gas-powered lights or torches or, you know, whatever the modern equivalent of a street light was. And things were not LED lit like they are today. You know, they didn't have the kind of lighting. So when we think of lighting, you know, we look out front and you see a street light and you think of that kind of lighting. I'm thinking more like some of the little creepy places you and I've crawled around in New Orleans, where they got that one little gas lantern in the middle of the courtyard.
Right.
You can see, but can you really see down all the corridors, and can you really see behind the bushes? And
no,
you really can't.
No, you can't. You never can. No.
So, you know, somebody mysteriously appears out of the dark. Well, all right, 1830, 1850, 1880, 1910 was pretty easy to do. A lot of these spectral characters are designed as wearing dark cloaks, wearing odd devices. Who knows what could qualify as an odd device? Because you also have to remember, we're also crossing over into what we would call the steampunk era, where you had the person tinkering home trying to invent something or design a new machine, or, you know, the Industrial Revolution was kind of rolling at this point. A lot of coal is being burned. So the nights are dark and cloudy and sooty and gritty, and you know, it's just not a clean, it's not a sanitary place. So he appears out of the fog and the darkness. Do you hear him coming, yes or no? Well, I'm a big guy. I can walk pretty darn quiet if I want to. You know, and let's say if you were a professional thief, nothing says you can't put a little something on the bottom of your shoes to not make you go stomp, stomp, stomp on the cobblestones, which would give you kind of a funny, like dressed in oilskin appearance. A lot of these people you hear descriptions like that of lots of lanterns were in use. If you think like a miner's helmet or a miner's lantern, you know, many of these characters were said to exhale flames at people. Well, if they were wearing a lantern of some kind, it would probably be like a miner's, and I guess you could say that light or that little flicker of flame was very scary, very terrorizing. So, you know, there's just so much about that situation that just raises the terror. When you get into those seedy neighborhoods, there's a lot of alcoholism, abuse, and prostitution. So, you know, who's the predator and who's the prey changes very, very rapidly.
Well, we'll come back in just a minute and we'll discuss who is the predator and who exactly is the prey. We'll be right back. Step beyond the veil that separates our world from the world of the spirits with me, Kalila Smith, as we uncover the mysteries of the afterlife. This is a spiritual journey as we try to discover if life really does continue after the physical death. Are after-death communications real, or do we imagine them? Get my book, Afterlife Mysteries Revealed, and find out. Afterlife Mysteries Revealed, available on Amazon.com by Kalila Smith. All right, so we're back. So, really, both of these characters, but a lot of people try to interchange the two. Spring Heel Jack, Jack the Ripper, not the same person, though, right?
No, we don't have Jack the Ripper leaping over things and disappearing. Jack the Ripper was never really supernatural. The police were on it. There were lots of clues. There were letters written to the the very famous letters written. Lots of clues that have been investigated all throughout the years. Jack the Ripper never appeared otherworldly. Jack the Ripper has probably been more terrifying in the fact that he could have been any bloke walking down the street.
Or a doctor.
Or
a doctor.
Or a butcher, or, the John you're trying to pick up for the evening. Or he was just some guy. And I guess that made him even scarier and much more of a political touch point, because at the time he really was a massive political touch point over the entire Whitechapel area. There's a lot of politics involved, of course.
Of course.
A lot of rumors. There was even a rumor that Jack the Ripper could have been a member of royalty.
Or a representative thereof. In fact, speaking of royalty, I've actually consulted with our in-house British expert, our psychic, Billy Roberts, who has worked many, many times with the police in the UK on various crimes and so forth. And I got his opinion on it, and I got a little tape here we'll look at, and we'll kind of get his input on Jack the Ripper.
Cool.
Well, in Liverpool, there was a man in the 1800s. He was a doctor, and his name was James Maybrick. I don't know if you've heard of him.
No.
And he was married to an American. And he used to go to a local chemist every day, and he'd buy strychnine. Now, the story is that you can take strychnine. It's part of amphetamine. It's a stimulant. They use it in amphetamine. But if you can make the body tolerant by building the amount of strychnine in your system. Well, this guy was married, but to this American, and he died. Now, she was accused of killing him, poisoning him, until the chemist verified that her husband used to come in and buy strychnine himself for medicinal purposes. Now, she was freed. She was freed from custody, and she went allegedly back to America. But recently, about 1975 or something, they were renovating the house he lived in. He lived very close to the main railway line to London. And apparently this guy used to go every week by train to London, this doctor, and take his surgical bag with him. And when they were renovating the house, the workmen pulled up the floorboards and they found a diary. And there were all these accounts of people that he had allegedly killed. But it said at the beginning, on the first page, "I am Jack." Now, there's a big article in a local newspaper because there was a big controversy, and they believed that he was Jack the Ripper, James Maybrick. But there are other stories. Local writers have discounted that and come up with some other theories. But it's an interesting story. Next time we speak, I'll let you know more details about it. But his name is James Maybrick. You can Google him.
Interesting. Yeah, very interesting. Because they were pretty convinced that Jack the Ripper had medical knowledge. I mean, he had medical knowledge. Now, the axe murderer in New Orleans, the axe murderer actually wrote a Jack Ripper-like letter to the newspaper. So I think he was trying to be like Jack the Ripper, and he wrote it, and it was from hell, and it was written to dear esteemed mortals.
Right.
Very interesting. I'll have to cut and paste it to you because
I'd like to see that.
it's in one of my books, the actual letter. I'll have to Google it and see. But it talks about I was never human and you will never catch me. Very, very interesting. But I think he wanted to play on that Jack the Ripper theme. But you can tell, I did compare the letters at one time, and you could tell that the person who wrote the axe murderer letter did not have anywhere near the education of Jack the Ripper.
Yeah,
they're writing, and it'd be interesting to look at their handwriting.
Yeah, it would be.
Compare the handwriting and see, the differences there. But you could tell it was not that he was not as literate and didn't have the vocabulary that Jack the Ripper had, because Jack the Ripper was very much more eloquent in his vocabulary than this particular person was trying to be. But all very interesting stories. I mean, it's just fascinating.
The other theory was that he was acting on behalf of the royal family, because one of the kings anyway was he frequented brothels, and he had a penchant for redhead prostitutes because they were all redheaded apparently, and so they had this man going around killing all the prostitutes that he'd been with. And that was a theory that was bandied around. There's a lot written about it, but the James Maybrick one makes more sense to me. I mean, because it tallies in with everything else that's written about it, because he used to go to London quite a lot. And a lot of the murders were in London. I think all of them were, weren't they?
Submitted for your approval. New Orleans. Seductive, magical, mysterious, and haunted. There is no place on this earth with as much ghost and vampire activity as New Orleans. Imagine, if you will, a tour that takes you to sites in the French Quarter of actual documented hauntings. The Haunted History Tour is just that tour. Every day, every night, all year round. This tour has been featured on ABC, CBS, NBC, and CNN, and it's available to you. Are there ghosts and vampires in the French Quarter? Find out by taking the tour that everyone is talking about, the Haunted History Tour. For more information, call Haunted History Tours at 861-2727. That's 861-2727. This is not a Halloween spookhouse. This is real.
So, Alan, he's got an interesting perspective on things, I mean, it's just a little bit more firsthand since he's living there, but it seems to fall in line with everything you're saying as well.
Well, he can just walk over and go see where something happened.
Yeah, well, he was,
I mean,
he can follow.
Honestly, I mean, I've been on your tours in New Orleans.
Yeah, he can definitely follow in the footsteps right over there. It's very interesting. But he also had a little bit to say about Spring Hill Jack, and this is kind of interesting because he claimed that his grandmother actually had an encounter. So check this out.
My grandmother saw him in the early 1900s.
Oh my goodness!
He was seen. He had a fiery face. Many people believed that he was a part of a circus troupe, and he was able to leap from a road right over a rooftop. And my mum was born in 1915, and she was only very, very tiny. My grandmother was taking her home, and it was a cinema called the Astoria, and a crowd had gathered, and this man appeared with a cloak, a fiery face, very elongated, and he just crouched down, and all of a sudden he leapt right over the building onto the run, and he had this very sardonic laugh and smile. Well, he was seen all over the UK at the time. He never actually hurt anybody, but he did appear in front of people, and he would knock on somebody's door, And a young lady opened it because he was seen right through the 1800s as well. And he just grinned fiendishly. And then he'd leap, he'd jump very high. So yeah, Spring-Heeled Jack, fancy you knowing about him.
So another interesting perspective there. But again, it's all kind of falling in line with the same things the stories that we've heard and so forth. It's interesting, though, that both of these characters, especially Spring-Heeled Jack, people started seeing him, you said, in the United States as well, right?
Well, here's the really frightening thing is the descriptions are just amazing. It's always a gentleman kind of looking fellow. And so we always take that as being very aristocratic or well-dressed or standing and walking straight, probably a slender person. And so at the distance, there's nothing there to cause you fear. It's a gentleman walking down the street. You don't have anything to fear until it gets close and grabs your money bag or your purse or your groceries. And the weird thing to Spring-Heeled Jack is there's always this supernatural ability to jump. Right. He doesn't fly or anything. And, I again, kind of going back, playing with the idea of steampunk. Pulleys and ropes and this kind of stuff. This is not new technology. We didn't just think this up in the 50s. Pulleys and ropes and that kind of stuff have been around decades, if not hundreds of years. Block and tackle, that type of thing. And, I was kind of giving it a little weird thought. And I went, if you and your mates were going to rob somebody, and in a typical modern city, this wouldn't work. But let's pick on New Orleans. When you're walking down the street and you're looking at these buildings and you're walking by these walls, what's on the other side of that wall, Kalila?
You never can tell. It could be a lot of things. It's usually very, very lush gardens.
Bingo.
Sometimes a pool, maybe a tree or two here or there, but it's usually pretty lavish with greenery and shrubbery and so forth.
So what if we set up kind of a magic trick? Use the dark ropes, use the dark this, the dark that. We set up the alleyway the way we want it. And when the victim comes down the alleyway, you could honestly be lowered. You could magically appear in the fog by being lowered by a pulley and block from the other side of the wall. Commit your dastardly deed, have your mates haul the rope real fast. As soon as somebody screams, they yank the rope and yank you back over the wall.
Interesting concept. Yeah, I guess it's possible. Yeah.
I'm just kind of throwing out there, criminals can get very, very creative. And especially if you were in like the middle of the block. Because now to get to you in the center of this, somebody now has to run all the way down to a courtyard entrance and try to catch you before you make your escape another direction. Would make you almost impossible to catch.
Well, right. If they're courtyards or anything like that.
Just throwing out there.
You couldn't, if you got into one courtyard, you'd have to leap over multiple walls in order to get to the other courtyards.
So, working here in Memphis, we were working on a property that had been built between 1900 and 1910, or more or less. And we were refinishing it, getting ready to turn it into a business again. And one of the things we found underneath the sidewalk, okay, so you walked down the sidewalk, you stepped up onto the threshold, and you entered the building. Well, the building had a basement. So you went to the back of the store, you went down the stairs into the basement that actually extended out underneath the street. And one of the cool things we found was what was affectionately known as a spider hole. So this was at one time where there was a platform built that went up to the bottom of the sidewalk. And if you were up to something nefarious, you went and committed your crime and your mates were watching out for you, you came running back, they would literally pick up the sidewalk tile. You would jump in the hole, and they would put the sidewalk tile back down.
Oh my God.
So
that's crazy.
You disappeared.
Wow. Yeah.
And the cool thing is, in the basement, the spider hole still exists, even though there's been another sidewalk put on top of the original one. So it doesn't work anymore, but it's there. So
Right.
it tells you the extent a criminal will go to be able to get away with their crime.
Okay.
So just kind of rolling out there. But, the scary thing is we with, especially like Spring Hill Jack, we keep seeing similar descriptions occasionally from country to country. Not only just London, not England, not just the Victorian era, but all the way up to modern times. There have been U.S. sightings. So, welcome to one of those urban legends that I'm sure has a reality to it, but yet it's been going on now for a very long time.
Interesting. All right, well, let's take a little break and we'll come back and kind of see if we can figure out if maybe all of these Jacks are possibly the same person.
Ooh.
We'll be right back. Follow me, Kalila Smith, into the mysterious world of spirits. Searching for Spirits, the ultimate guide for ghost hunters, is a concise how-to manual for anyone who enjoys a good ghost hunt. Learn the history of spiritualism, learn what a ghost is and what is not. Learn the truth about poltergeist. We'll also delve into the realm of spiritual beings that never were human, the world of demons, real vampires, and we'll look at some real case studies. This is a must-have for everyone interested in ghost hunting, from the novice to the expert. Completely updated in its second edition, this is one of the first guides for ghost hunting based on actual first-hand experiences. Available on Amazon.com. Searching for Spirits, the ultimate guide for ghost hunters, by Kalila Smith. Okay, so we're back. So, this Spring Hill Jack, he doesn't just bolt over walls. He kind of got around a little bit. He kind of went all over the world, right?
Yeah, we had U.S. sightings. We've had East Coast sightings. The sightings have been going on as Spring Hill Jack of 1830. I think it was in 1833, the mayor of London actually kind of made it official that we're inquiring into this and we're going to catch this guy. And, but he keeps popping up. Even as late as like 1945, we've got a character in Czechoslovakia that has magical leaping abilities and looks a lot, if you read the description, looks a lot like Spring Hill Jack.
So our Jack underneath the lamppost may have not been a vampire at all. He might have been a spin-off of this character right here because he didn't attack anybody.
Well, all right.
It was his appearance that made people think he was a vampire.
Exactly.
And the relationship of the name Jack to Jacques Saint Germain, it was a lot of things people just putting two and two together and said, oh, well, that must be who this guy is. Because a lot of people think that Jacques Saint Germain was more of a supernatural being and never really left the city. But this could be just a totally different character and more of a Spring Hill Jack, because he does have more of that characteristics. Because he never attacked anyone.
Well, we also have probably 1,000, identifications throughout history of the mysterious stranger.
Oh, now which one is this?
Well, it just of, the Great American Wild Wild West. Some feller wandered into our campsite at dusk. And by dawn, he was gone, and there weren't even boot prints in the sand, kind of thing. The mysterious stranger of the guy you were sitting next to at the bar talking to that had a slightly funny accent or smoked some kind of bizarre cigarette, or there was something not native, I guess is the best word I can use about this person. And you get up and go to the bathroom, and you come back and you go, well, where'd Bob over here go? And everybody goes, I don't know what you're talking about.
Oh, that could be a ghost.
Well, but you have so
Just
many
saying.
of those. You have so many of those reports, and a lot of them are they were aristocratic. You're sitting there, and this lovely young lady comes over and sits down next to you, and or is at the table across from you, and you look away for a minute, you come back, and and these all have that kind of gothic appearance to them.
Mm-hmm.
There's always the leather or the cloak or the dark clothing or the amount of lace, or there's always something about them that makes them look, I guess, a bit antique. Is that a good description?
Yeah.
And in very vintage, and in a city like New Orleans, there's an entire subculture of people that dress like that.
Right.
Well, but those are regular people, and you hear them walk across the floor. But
Right.
Yet there are dozens and dozens and dozens of reports, and you've heard them on the tours, where people tell you, "Oh, well,
yeah,
she was walking across the floor, but the weirdest thing is I didn't hear her walking."
But lots of times
Or-
that's, people consider that to be like a ghost story, more of a supernatural being. They're there. You're seeing this image of this person, and then the person just disappears. And that's
But
kind of
you
a common
interact
theme
with
in some
them.
of the. Well, yeah. Well, that's what they call intelligent hauntings, where
Mhm.
you can interact with people. And there's been many ghost stories. The Place d'Armes Hotel, where people see the man on the balcony, the bearded man on the balcony, who has a conversation with them. And he tells them where to go to eat, where to go to listen to music, where not to go in the city. And you go back in your room, you come back out, and the man is gone. And the classic story of, the two women who wanted to talk to him again because they had other questions, and they go down to the desk clerk and they say, we were talking to this gentleman. We want to find out who's in the room next to us because he was on the balcony. He had a beard. We were speaking to him. He gave us all this wonderful information, and he doesn't answer his door. Can we find out a little information about him? And the desk clerk pulls up the room and says, well, the room's empty. And they said, no, that's impossible. He was there. And they just laugh and say, oh, that's our ghost. Everybody sees him.
Well, but I think that in many ways kind of ties into some of these Jack stories, because, vintagely dressed, interesting looking, an unusual character under a street light, and, they say something very enigmatic to you, like, lovely full moon we're having, I wouldn't go down Canal Street for the next hour, stuff that maybe doesn't make sense to you, but makes a great story when you get back to Minnesota.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But yeah, being in New Orleans, I hear stories like that all the time. And I've actually been in places and have firsthand seen people who appeared to be there and then they were not there. And it didn't happen often, but when I started doing that bus tour and going into some of the cemeteries, I started seeing that sort of thing where, and then turn to someone and say, did you just see that person that was standing by the tree, and have someone else say, yes, they walked behind the tree and then they were gone. And so, I hear this kind of stuff all the time. So, and you're not surprised that I hear this stuff all the time.
No, not in the slightest. Well, you and I have been on enough investigations and enough conventions and stuff that people just walk over them again telling us these things.
Right, exactly.
And so tying into the Spring Hill Jack thing, of the true classic Spring Hill Jack is a person with, possibly claw-like fingers attacking a woman, is pretty much the classic. That's your Victorian villain. And what I find interesting is there was actually a villain in the Penny Dreadfuls at the time called Varney the Vampire.
Right.
And Varney would appear leering through your window and had nails like metal that he would tap on the glass to get your attention or scratch down them. So even at that time, there was a pop culture reference to this exact same behavior.
Right. And blaming the vampire, of course.
Well, but Varney was a penny dreadful. He was
Right.
it was a trash novel of, but also at the time, keep in mind, out of this also comes Jekyll and Hyde, Frankenstein, the free love movement, spiritualism of, we get into Sherlock Holmes, we get into, such amazing works of literature. And a lot of the dime store cheap stuff was quite sensational. You had Dr. Polidori, you had Lord Byron, you had, So, the literature and pop culture of the time is just about as bad then as it is now. So, there are a lot of references being printed, and of course, newspapers were sensational. Woman attacked last night by Spring Hill Jack, was scratched on the back of the neck. Oh, what a terrible, and, maybe she was, maybe she wasn't. We weren't, let's just say police techniques were a little primitive in those days. So could a character like Jacques Saint-Germain have been several different people in several different places? I don't, during the human lifetime, especially if you were careful about your diet and what you did, most people were keeling over and dying in their 30s and 40s. But if you were careful, there are a lot of cases of people living into their 60s and 70s and looking pretty good. And let's face it, a little dark lighting, some cool clothing never hurt.
Works every time.
But, if you ran into this aristocratic looking person 10 years ago and you lead a hard life, you look like you've aged 30 years. And the next time you see this character, they shockingly don't look like they've aged at all.
No, right.
So, I mean, I'm just kind of throwing out that there's options that meant if you were, let's just say you were a nefarious person in this country, by the time you got over here, you could be somebody entirely else.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Especially in a place like New Orleans or even Memphis, any port city.
Oh, gosh, Memphis.
Natchez. We know Natchez was the under the hill area. I mean, everybody had, I know in New Orleans, people could come here, take on a whole different persona, live under the grid. And of course, that accounted for a lot of times when, people disappearing. And, if nobody knows you're here to begin with, nobody's going to notice when you're gone either.
Right.
So you've got that whole factor. And that's the way it's always been here, as well as Natchez, as well as Memphis, anywhere along the river.
Well, and also the person you created when you moved here can die here. Because there are many famous cases of people leaving New Orleans in the blaze of glory, sin, fire, police attraction, mobs are going to kill. I mean, there are many, many, many cases.
Delphine Lalaurie, absolutely, yeah.
Bingo.
So, disappeared. Nobody heard or seen from her again. But we're going to come right back. We're going to take a little break, and we're going to come back and try to figure out all these mysteries. We'll be right back.
Imagine it's the year 2020. With so many podcasts, streams, and interesting stations, you've finally found your paranormal hotspot. We want to personally invite you to join the discussion by tuning in and listening to The Seance Room. With all new and returning guests, intriguing investigative explorations, and scintillating conversations with the beyond. With your hosts, Victor and Linda Salazar.
Hey, Victor here. Are you ready to evoke strange curiosities? walk through parallel dimensions, and delve together into the controversial science of paraphenomena.
Afraid to question the shadow in your room, footsteps down the hall when no one's home? Bothered you'll become one of those people? Leaving no stone unturned, no topic unanswered. Dim the lights, turn up the volume. This is Linda. You've reached the threshold of your Para-Podcast.
Let's not forget Norma, a.k.a. Mama C.
Hi, I'm Mama C. Grab your favorite cocktail, find your comfy spot, and join me as we engage in some supernatural interactions that will knock your boots off.
Oh, and I'm Rick. I just sit behind all the pretty blinking lights. Be ready.
Welcome to the seance. Haunted airwaves, conversations with the beyond, chilling messages from spirits and odd engineers. The spirits are going live.
Kalila Smith.
All right, we're back. So, we've talked a little bit about, I started off with some people taking souvenirs like a kidney, and of course, I think Jack the Ripper kind of took some souvenirs too. But what if the souvenir is you? And that's what happened back in 2005. It was after Katrina, because we're just going through this hurricane here. I think you're still having it up there. But, back in Katrina, when the city was locked down for 2 months, we had a lot of people that didn't want to leave. People just were so dead set on staying in their homes. You know how people are. They think, I'm fine here, I don't want to leave. You got no electricity, you got no water, there's no way to get food to you, you're surrounded by water. They're trying to get people out of here. So the National Guard, of course, is out here knocking on doors saying, you gotta leave. You gotta get out. You gotta get out and go somewhere safe. You're gonna be here with no provisions for 2 months. You have to leave. And there was one particular gentleman, it was a guy named John. He was a reader in the square. Now, everybody knew this guy. This guy was probably in his 40s. He was an ex-military person. He had been a reader for a number of years. And he was kind of famous for walking from the Marigny into Jackson Square. And he always pulled this large trunk with him. It had wheels on the back of it. And he would pull the large trunk. He would set it up in the square. He'd put his little tablecloth on it, and this is where he did his readings. And at the end of the night, he folded up everything, he'd put it in the trunk, and then he'd drag his little trunk back home. Well, he was a pretty quiet guy. Nobody really thought much of him, very unassuming. But when the National Guard started to try to get him from his home, he kind of went crazy on them. He was adamant he was not leaving, and they said, sir, if you don't leave, we're going to drag you out. And they started physically pulling people out of their homes and arresting them to get them out of the city, to get them safe. Well, he was clinging to this suitcase thing, this trunk. He didn't want to leave the trunk, and he's trying to drag it down the stairs. And they're like, sir, you can't bring this with you. You cannot just bring your essentials. This is going to stay at your home. And he says, you don't understand, I have to have this. Well, he's struggling with the trunk. They're pulling on the trunk. Well, before you know it, the trunk slides down the steps, hits the sidewalk, burst open, and out falls his former girlfriend, Mama White. He had been bringing her around in that trunk for at least a decade, and nobody had any idea. He was living with a new girlfriend who was also a reader in one of the stores of someone I knew. And I mean, I knew these people. Everybody knew them. And the girl,
and he was a very public figure.
He was a very public, very prominent person. I mean, everybody knew who he was. Everybody knew who she was. She lived with him. She lived with the trunk. She had no idea that all of that time there was the mummified body of his former girlfriend, whom he had killed, inside the trunk. So you just never can tell who you can trust.
you know, well, I mean, that ties into
Scary.
the mysterious stranger, somebody you think you can trust. In this case, it was somebody she lived with. Goodness gracious.
Yeah. I mean, all she could think of course, was that could have been me.
Well, I don't think he had room for 2 trunks. You know, that's
You can only carry one at a time, right? But yeah,
But-
that was pretty bizarre. That was pretty strange.
you know, yes.
I know. There's just no words, right?
You just look at a case like that, and you look at some of the crazy urban legends that we have. In reality, you just can't make this stuff up.
You can't. And what's really strange is that one of our tour guides, in the process of trying to research this story, actually found 2 other cases, 2 of which happened on the same block, not as this one, but 2 on Ursuline Street that involved
Rough neighborhood.
putting people into suitcases. It must have been the thing to do. It must have been in vogue at some time to stuff them in a trunk or a suitcase, because we had quite a few cases of it happening right here in our little French Quarter. But so anyway, you just never can tell what somebody's going to want from you. Sometimes they want your money. Sometimes they want too much of your attention. Sometimes they want a kidney, and sometimes they just don't want to let go, and they stuff you into a trunk.
Oof.
So yes,
Wow.
yes. So anyway, so Alan, tell us about some of your other shows, because Alan's got some other podcasts going on. Alan's a real radio person. He's a real radio personality.
Oh my gosh.
Tell us about your real radio show.
I'm sorry. I'm still looking at that trunk going, oh. Well, you know, my co-host could have built that trunk, so it's kind of scary. I'm a co-host of Tool Talk Radio on the mighty990.com. We're we're basically a couple of old knuckleheads talking about tools. I'm also featured on MCFC Radio, a sci-fi convention radio show, formerly known as Nerds of Wisdom. So we talk to people like Kalila or Ned Canty from the opera, or, you know, people all over the country. We get to chat with them and talk about their geeky attributes. And of course, you and I do the Seance Room.
We are in the Seance Room on Friday nights, live now. We're doing live appearances on the podcast, The Seance Room, which is on Friday nights at 11 p.m. Central Time, and which is followed by this show, Scary Stories by Kalila. And I, of course, have my other show, which is Afterlife Radio Podcast with the great Billy Roberts of the UK, who is the creator of television psychics and mediums. So that's a lot of fun, too. So we've got a lot of little things going on, and we've now made our way into the world of video. So you're going to be seeing more of us on YouTube, and see more of us doing live Facebook shows as well. But I think that's the end of our stories for tonight. Hope you enjoyed it, and hope you have some pleasant nightmares this evening.
Sleep tight. Yeah.
Bye-bye.